Alright, it's time to move into larger packs, and as such I feel the need to reiterate the difference between these and complete packs before heading forward, as I'll admit that it is the most subjective distinction in all of this retrospective. Encore, and even Hekamecha from the previous category, are technically both finished products from their respective creators. However, they aren't full game overhauls. Both only change one game mode each. So, while one could argue that these two are essentially finished products, the fact that they don't operate as complete game overhauls the way the other complete packs do, keep them out of that category. This means that if ever in the future there was a way to make only a single category accessible, both of their positions could be reconsidered. Cool? Cool. Perhaps the most underrated and least known of the larger packs, Flubby's Monkey Ball is a 67 level pack, at least as of its current update, with levels covering beginner and advanced modes. Truth be told, this one's art direction is a bit too simple for my taste, even if it does remind me of Krabs' old skyboxes from way back, although it really isn't so much the focus of a hack of this scale. To elaborate, now that we're dealing with packs with a decent level density, more complex ideas like difficulty curves and reiteration of ideas can become important. And under these criteria, Flubby's pack gets a pass. Its curve isn't steep by any means, as it stays in line with the difficulty of the original two games as beginner and advanced modes, with the steep incline that comes with expert mode not applying here. As for the modes more specifically, advanced is far more standout than beginner, with the former being much simpler level design characteristic of a beginner mode. It works fine to that end, but aside from the stages containing warp goals, they weren't all that memorable. There's also a reskin of these levels found in World 1, but the world style doesn't really suit the levels as well, especially for Raceway, so one could argue story is best off skipped in its current state. Advanced, on the other hand, contains some of the best levels we've seen thus far, in my opinion comparable to Hekamecha's high bar. Wobbly floor, hopping, and switches are all great ramp challenges that encourage speed and challenge air control a bit, although I would have personally switched stages 2 and 15 around to make the progression of this challenge a little more natural. Pencil Stroke is a super unique stage with a very inventive use of a warp goal path as an obstacle for the regular goal path. Slalom is a fantastic speed stage with a ton of potential for a harder variant, as well as benefit from a banana bunch past the goal, a la coaster or gravity slider, and every bonus stage hits it out of the park, capturing the best elements of what made Monkey Ball 1's bonus stages so great. Sure, the desert area is a bit of an anticlimax, having simpler and less inspired level design than previous parts of Advanced, but it's still serviceable right up to the end, where we sadly encounter a case of what I'm going to call arthropod syndrome. But this time it's honestly even more frustrating because of how the level concept plays with previously used mechanics. Combining a launcher with precise air control sounds like the perfect send-off for this particular mode, as both of these obstacles were extremely prevalent in this pack. So imagine my disappointment when this level was not so much a test in precision as it should have been, but rather a near uncontrollable mess. This mounted in me having to use additional lives to complete this mode, which was something I was expressly planning not to do for this pack onward if I could. But I digress. I'll also briefly talk aesthetics here, as I consider that the weakest link of this pack. Pretty much every background appears as a box rather than a seamless space, and not in a way that really looks intentional. The only one where it kind of works is in the second extra background, where it kind of adds to the warped aesthetic it's going for, but for the rest it ends up looking pretty dated and could definitely use a new coat of paint. Still, even though I certainly have my gripes with its ending and looks for it in beginner, Advanced here is still great, nearly on the level of Hekamecha. As for Advanced Extra, it's sadly incomplete. The ones that are there are okay, but nothing too extraordinary if you'd want to stop at Advanced 30. Even just considering Beginner, Beginner Extra, and Advanced, Flubby's Monkey Ball still plays fantastic, and I can't wait to see what Expert looks like for it. Assuming development continues. Here we have the aforementioned Monkey Ball Ultra, a very promising Romhack that, as stated previously, has been dormant for over 3 years now. In spite of its relative age compared to the other larger pack entries, on top of its future being somewhat uncertain, I've still decided to look at it here rather than later. Similar to Flubby's pack, Ultra fills Beginner, Beginner Extra, and Advanced, with Advanced Extra also receiving a complete overhaul here. In this case, however, the quality and look of this pack is more uniform throughout, with a fairly light difficulty curve compared to the originals to boot. This may have to do with the surplus of bananas present rather than the level design, but the result is ultimately the same. Getting to Advanced Extra is a very doable task without any extra lives, which is a definite plus. There are some oddities in the level order though, notably with the lack of warp goals in the final area of Advanced, while Advanced Extra has one. Besides that though, the level design itself has some awkwardness likely due to the limitations still present when it came out. Some stages have begun to use portals to help streamline and sometimes simply realize a level concept, while just as many, if not more, use simpler but ultimately less functional and play-friendly elevator platforms. This isn't to say that this type of platform is inherently invalid, but it's very rare for it to make more sense than a portal when comparing the two options in a given level scenario. Again though, a big factor in this is most likely age. I don't necessarily mean to overly harp on age here, but I do think it is worth noting seeing as it's by far the oldest being covered in the larger pack section, and one of the oldest being covered in general. As such, I can't argue that the overall aesthetic and especially the skyboxes have aged since they were new, but it is worth noting that much of the polish here was well above par for the time, and much of it even looks quite solid to this day in the same way some of Krabs' work does. Both extra level themes certainly deserve a facelift though, as they're both simultaneously really interesting and unique, and yet also the least polished in the game. As for the specific levels that inhabit these skyboxes, there are certainly highlights. Brook is a great looking level that plays fine. Funhouse and Treehouse are solid Marble Madness-esque courses, even if they don't necessarily challenge you on previous level concepts the way an exam type stage should in my opinion. Turtleshell manages to use very simple geometry to great effect, and Bazaar and Windmills both play well and tie into the sort of underlying creepy carnival effect this level theme can produce sometimes. Propulsion Drive is a top tier speed level, especially for the time. Buoyancy has a fun and unique gimmick that works well enough, and Gong, assuming the issue of knowing where the elevators are could be resolved via portals, makes for a great final level for Advanced. The last two extra levels, Rorschach and Hyperloop, are pretty top notch as well, with the former perhaps being the closest to a good flock stage that's ever been developed, for what it's worth, and the other being a pretty good speed stage. Don't get me wrong though, there are some duds here. Gearfisher is far too cool a name for a level this basic. Rain Chain doesn't tend to play very well, with the bowls being a bit too shallow to correct your movements a significant amount of the time, and the extra stages are pretty hit or miss in general. Truth be told, that's pretty high marks for a level pack released just a little after Monkeyed Ball 1. And it's still definitely worth a play, but there is something kind of off about it. Something that doesn't inherently have a whole lot to do with the pack so much, but more its context. Remember that Ultra, Banana Bash, and Dimensions all started around the same time, and in a way this pack feels like the cap off to a trilogy of sorts that looks less certain than ever being completed. Or more of a quadrilogy, I guess, if you count Monkey Ball EX, since that's getting an update soon. I do hope that one day we see Expert and Master as to complete the trilogy of sorts, but until then, I suppose that what's here is still worth playing. Back to the modern era, Monkey Ball Madness is another beginner and advanced pack, albeit this time with a handful of stages missing as of its latest release. Not to jump to this tangent for too long, but I'll take this opportunity to mention the Romhack spreadsheet I've compiled, as it contains all of the best variants for each hack that are currently available. Unfortunately, the same can't exactly be said for the Romhacks directory on the SMB Workshop, hence why I don't necessarily recommend going there first if you're new. Anyways, Monkey Ball Madness's beginner actually poses a pretty great challenge curve for new and experienced players. This is accomplished by having each level offer a streamlined and easier path, with either a complicated but intended skip, or alternative path being made clearly available for more experienced players to attempt. This may seem like pretty simple game design, especially for a platformer, but accomplishing this in levels as self-contained and short as most Monkey Ball stages can be extremely complicated and difficult. Even most official stages don't attempt it. Madness manages to do this with a pretty solid success rate, however, with the majority of stages having fun alternative options rather than being completely linear. The ones that are linear, though, are the weakest in beginner. They aren't bad, but none of them have contraindications to them having warp roll sections or even just intended skips. Take Kickers for example. The stage could totally have thinner, faster moving parts that contain green or even red goals, or if doing that would mess up level progression too much, maybe add a thin ramp that also acts as a conveyor. It's hard to stay on, but if you can stay on it, you can skip the last obstacle entirely, completing the stage considerably faster. These are just ideas, of course, but all this just goes to show that even the few stages here that don't offer these sorts of pathing could, if they were slightly tweaked. The best example of this sort of level design in action is Diversion Channel, which honestly was the first to make me look at these beginner levels with a more fine-tooth comb than I usually do. Both for that, and it kept being as fun to pull off as it is, it very well might be my favorite stage in the pack. Even the well-designed ones aren't all necessarily winners though, entirely due to their placement. Barometric is a great level that plays better than most of its ilk, but frankly Beginner Extra 2 is way too early for a level this difficult. By removing the button at the bottom that lets you kind of undo the gimmick, this is turned into a top-notch advanced extra stage. Ravine and Descent leave beginner on an undoubtable high note though, leaving Madness with the strongest beginner mode we've looked at thus far, with the potential to make it even better as development continues. As for Advanced, it's also pretty well handled overall, albeit with a few more caveats than beginner mode. The return of gnarly options from the level jams is great to see, as brutal as that red goal may be. Beveled Maze is an above average maze level, and Torque, while a bit unintuitive for the average player to figure out the red goal on, plays just fine when going for the blue goal. Once you get to the Candy World though, the level design does become a bit more hit or miss. The carousels, even if it was placed a little too early, and Major Third are both great levels, some of my favorites in the pack. Advanced Extra picks back up with some great speed stages and even a fun group Goldbergian level, something we don't get enough of in SMB ROM hacking in my opinion. Overall, I still somewhat prefer the stages in Beginner to those in Advanced, seeing as Advanced doesn't have as many of those dual option stages Beginner does, but both difficulties here really do have a lot to offer, with a whole bunch of new and interesting developments being made as we speak.
I'd also be remiss not to mention the bonus stages, as Madness contains one of the best ones I've ever played, Carnival Game. It's fast-paced, rewards momentum, and is extremely rewarding in terms of the banana totals you can get from it if you play well. The rest range from pretty good to forgettable, but still not bad at all as far as bonus stages go.
I'll also briefly mention Expert, as this particular demo uses that difficulty to show off some scattered ideas from across the game that have yet to be totally ironed out. They aren't exactly connected to what's contained in the other two modes though, so I'd suggest just going through Beginner and Advanced unless that intrigues you. Visually, Monkey Ball Madness shows signs of still being very much in the works. The first area looks pretty nice, and the first half of Extra looks similarly solid, but the rest are varying degrees of rough, with Bonus and Underwater perhaps being the most incomplete looking of the bunch. This isn't to say that any of it is garish or generally displeasing to look at, but I was glad to hear that much of it is in the process of getting a major facelift right now in development. All in all, a very promising pack. Alright, we've made it to the last of what I would currently consider the large-scale packs. Super Monkey Ball, Encore. You may have remembered that early on I briefly talked about this hack's predecessor, which just took the SMB2 level themes and gave them a completely new texture palette. It did this job well enough, but it ultimately does stop at texture changes in its scope. Encore, however, includes 60 stages all to its own. Unlike you may expect though, it doesn't use Expert to accomplish this. Instead, Encore uses the SMB Deluxe and 2 ROM to fill up the 60 stages in beginner mode. While that technically means this hack in particular has the least levels of any of the large-scale packs, I'd argue that it nonetheless has the most overall polish out of any of them. Every single background here is fantastic, especially the ones based off of Monkey Ball 1. The highlight is definitely Sky High, at least as far as I'm concerned, which through a small handful of changes magically turns into Sonic Unleashed Apotos. Really though, every single one of these is pretty fantastic. As for the level design held inside those level themes, they're now to a point where I don't think there's a single dud level, a wild improvement from the previous release of Encore. The only time I experienced any issues in terms of level design was in Extra Stage 6, wherein the first ledge doesn't exactly telegraph that there's nothing behind it. Even a steeper other side that was tough to get out of would have been an improvement from what's currently there, but I digress. Everything else, even the particularly difficult ones, all makes sense. It's a solidity in terms of level design that comes very much appreciated, and is rarely seen in Monkey Ball. Solid really is the first thing that comes to mind with Encore. It might not be my favorite in terms of level design, but it's all solid. Even if its level themes aren't built from scratch, they're still solid. Even the difficulty curve is solid, with the only stage being too early for my taste being Sinusoidal. Okay, screw this, I'm looking that up.
It just means sine wave? Just call it sine wave swerve. Okay, come on, Rain. I know you're a professor, but you don't have to teach me physics and geometry in a Monkey Ball ROM. Anyway.
Sinusoidal swerve is placed a little too early, but it can be skipped via an earlier warp goal, so I suppose it gets a pass. Warp goals and banana placements are also well handled, leaving Encore as one of the best and easily the most solid experience I've had thus far with a Monkey Ball ROM hack. Well, that's all 4 of the larger packs finally covered. There are certainly a lot fewer of these to go through compared with the small packs, but even with only 4 to look at, it's pretty clear the differences that come with designing a larger ROM hack compared to a smaller one, even in Encore's case where it's all in one mode. Having double or even nearly triple the level count certainly allows for each of these to stand more on their own as individual experiences, rather than the more homogenized experience blasting through the smaller hacks often was. I can genuinely recommend each and every one of these for one reason or another, although in the case of Madness it may be worth it to wait until that final build comes out. For Flubby, Ultra, and Encore though, I'd say you're safe to jump in and see what they have to offer. For now though, I'd say it's time to move into our last stop before the complete packs discussion. Cancelled Romhacks. See you there.